what's going on with slaves. How did it start? Well, it's been going on since day one, really. After Adam and Eve, if they existed, they had slaves. Right the way through to today, and they still have slaves today. If you go to Saudi Arabia or any other Middle East country, you will find enslaved Filipinos, Pakistanis, Indians, not blacks, but the Asians. They're usually because the Asians have got more abilities and they've had reasonably good education. So they're still slaves. In this country, we have, again, with our Saudi friends, we have domestics who are enslaved, their passports taken off them, they're given absolutely rubbish wages, and they live in appalling conditions. What do? Nothing, because Saudi is one of the people we don't want to upset. So we leave it alone. But to go back to the original lot that everyone knows about, the Golden Triangle, it went from the Caribbean to Africa, to the UK, to Brazil, to America. It just went round and round and round and round. Now, the great thing about ships is that you do not want them sat in a port, because it's costing you money. So slavers had a very good system set up. They used to use the tribal chiefs and paramount chiefs to send their people out collecting slaves. So they'd go out and round up slaves, and some of them were lucky, it was only a few miles from the coast, others had several hundred miles to walk, and they were usually chained or had wooden yokes, yoked two together. So the slavers in the ships arrived, they bought the slaves and loaded them onto their ships and paid for them using alcohol, weapons and beads. This went on all the time. The worst one was Portugal. Portugal shipped millions, I think it was something like about 15 million slaves into Brazil, to operate their various plantations. Brazil was, of course, the last one of the big slaving countries to ban it, to abolish slavery, and that was in 1898 when they banned it. UK was a little bit better. We stopped slaving in 1807, but it didn't really get finished till about 1866, because not many people realised that slavery had been abolished, particularly out in Africa. So it just sort of carried on. Now, who else were enslaved to actually do plantation work? Not all of them. How many slaves do you think that the Native Americans had?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, how many do you think?
They were quite a lot.
100,000.
Cherokee had.
Yeah, it's 100,000 with probably, I think it's something like about 12 different tribes, and it was 100,000 slaves. So we're going to ask the American Indians, the Native Americans, to pay reparations? Well, I don't think that will happen because they're quite powerful. Who else? Now, this is where it gets silly. In 1830, they had a survey, census, right? There were 37,000 freed slaves from Africa in the country. Now, of those 37,000, 12,000 owned slaves. And you're talking in terms of over 20,000 slaves. It's over a period, it just kept going up and up. So there we have a situation of how do we get them to pay reparations to the slaves? Because they're freed, but they were using slaves. It gets very complicated, doesn't it? And so there we have the situation that you've got Native Americans, you've got black freed slaves that have got the same problem, they're taking slaves. And when I was in Liberia, Liberia was the country founded, well not founded by, but set up by President Monroe, before Abraham Lincoln. And he set it up because he really didn't like the idea of having all of these freed slaves, because you'd have a black power base. And so the way to get rid of them was to send them out to Liberia and Sierra Leone. And he did all of that in, what was it, 1870s, I think that was. Because in 1847, Liberia became an independent country. But our lads shipped over there to Liberia. Great. What did they do? Settled in there and built villages, and even Monrovia, the capital, which is named after Monroe. What else did they do? Well, they moved inland, taking land, and taking slaves. These again were ex-slaves in Africa buying slaves and pushing the indigenous people further and further inland. So you've got a situation that people are bloody awful. You know, I really find it difficult to understand how people could do that. But remember our wonderful Queen Elizabeth I. She hated it. She wouldn't let anybody in the UK or England go out on slaving trips. Until near the end, she realised it was pretty lucrative. So she gave Captain Hawkins 2 Royal Navy ships to go and have a look. And they realised that it was something they ought to be doing. So they started looking at slaves from then on. So I think that it would be ridiculous asking UK governments to pay reparations to people who are families of the slaves unless you do it to everybody else. You know, why the hell should the black slavers get away with it? Why the hell should the Native Americans get away with it? The Americans have already sort of set theirs up, so the American government is starting to do it. But why Portuguese, Dutch, all of these slaving countries didn't give any reparations. They just used slaves for as long as they wanted. Until 1867 to 1890 roughly was when they all started banning it. But I don't think they should give them any money. I think that they should actually get them to apologise.